It was a regular Wednesday evening, or so I thought. I had just returned from a long day at work, eager to unwind and enjoy a quiet dinner. As I entered our apartment, I heard the muffled sounds of shouting and what seemed like crashing furniture coming from the neighbor's place. My heart raced, something was clearly wrong. I quickly went next door to check on them. To my dismay, I found them in a state of chaos. Their home was a mess, and the tension in the air was palpable. I tried to help them calm down, but my mind was already racing back to my own apartment. The anxiety gnawed at me, making me eager to escape the unsettling situation. Back at home, I noticed something strange. Sarah's phone was lying on the kitchen counter, the screen lit up. My first instinct was to leave it alone, but a curious thought crossed my mind. I picked it up and saw an open message thread with her colleague, Lucas. My stomach churned as I skimmed through the messages. They were anything but professional. My heart sank as I realized they were intimate, affectionate exchanges between them. My hands shook as I scrolled through, each message a knife twisting deeper into my gut. Betrayal, anger, confusion, it all hit me at once. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. I knew I had to do something, but what? The anger bubbling inside me demanded retribution. I was an IT specialist. I had the skills to exact revenge. The idea took root quickly. Why not use my expertise to turn the tables? I decided to act. I began by gathering all the necessary information. Their work email addresses, passwords, and any security details I could find. It wasn't long before I was deep into the process of hacking their accounts. I felt a dark satisfaction as I maneuvered through their digital defenses. My first target was Lucas. I infiltrated his work account and retrieved all the sensitive emails and files related to his work. Then, I moved on to Sarah. The process was eerily straightforward. With each step, the sense of power grew stronger, overshadowing any lingering doubts. With the data in hand, I crafted a message, a detailed exposé of their private conversations, and shared it with every single employee at their company. The thrill of revenge was a heady cocktail, and I watched with grim satisfaction as the emails flew out, attaching all the damning evidence. The aftermath was swift. I monitored the reactions with a mix of satisfaction and unease. The office was abuzz with whispers, calls, and messages of disbelief. Sarah and Lucas were quickly summoned for meetings that would no doubt end in termination. The public shaming had begun, and their private lives were now a matter of office gossip. As the dust began to settle, I couldn't help but feel a strange emptiness. I had achieved what I set out to do, but at what cost? Sarah and Lucas were in ruins, their careers and reputations in tatters. And there I was, standing amidst the wreckage, wrestling with my own sense of triumph and remorse. The days following the email debacle were a whirlwind of chaos and fallout. I had expected the drama to unfold, but witnessing the consequences firsthand was something else entirely. I found myself fixated on the aftermath, grappling with a mix of satisfaction and creeping doubt. Sarah and Lucas were called into their respective offices for urgent meetings. I watched from a distance as they walked out, their faces pale and resigned. Their colleagues shot them pitying glances, and hushed whispers seemed to follow them wherever they went. The atmosphere in their office was charged with a sense of scandal. And the once bustling workplace had turned into a hotbed of gossip and judgment. I had been careful not to leave any trace that could link me to the hack, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my actions were starting to unravel. My phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages from friends and acquaintances who had heard about the scandal. The story had spread beyond the office and was making waves in the community. At home, Sarah was a ghost of her former self. She barely spoke, her eyes red from sleepless nights and endless crying. I could tell she was desperate to understand what had gone wrong and to fix the situation, but there was nothing left to salvage. The damage was done, and the guilt gnawed at me like an insistent itch. Lucas, too, was struggling. He had been a frequent visitor at our apartment, and now, he was nowhere to be seen. The few times I saw him in public, he was accompanied by a thick cloud of humiliation. His job had evaporated overnight, and with it, his reputation. He had been a rising star in his company. But now he was left to deal with the fallout of his actions. My own life, meanwhile, was far from peaceful. The sense of victory I had initially felt was slowly giving way to a profound emptiness. I had achieved what I set out to do, but the satisfaction was fleeting. Each time I looked at Sarah, I was reminded of the pain and betrayal I had caused. My own actions had dismantled not just their lives but also the trust that once existed between us. As days turned into weeks, the tension at home became unbearable. Sarah and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was often a heated argument or a strained conversation. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken words and broken promises. I was haunted by the images of their devastated faces, and the weight of my own decisions began to press down on me. The company where Sarah and Lucas worked had begun a formal investigation into the breach, and it wasn't long before the police got involved. I followed the news with a mix of dread and curiosity. The investigation seemed to be progressing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before my actions might be traced back to me. Amidst the turmoil, I received a call from an old friend who worked in law enforcement. He was concerned about my well-being, having heard about the scandal. He offered me advice, though I could sense the concern in his voice. I assured him I was fine, but deep down, I knew I was far from okay. As the investigation continued, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The initial thrill of revenge had given way to a sobering realization: my actions had irreversible consequences. I had hoped to find closure, but instead, I was left with a profound sense of regret. The lives I had disrupted were now a constant reminder of the destructive power of my own decisions. Sarah and Lucas's careers were over, and their personal lives had been laid bare for everyone to see. My own sense of justice felt hollow, and I was left to confront the reality of the damage I had inflicted. In the end, the quest for revenge had brought nothing but sorrow and regret, and I was left to navigate the wreckage of the lives I had shattered. The months after the scandal seemed to stretch on endlessly, filled with awkward silences and strained interactions. The initial shock of the fallout had faded, but the weight of my actions was a constant, heavy presence in my life. Sarah and I had grown distant, and the cracks in our relationship were now too wide to ignore. Sarah tried to rebuild her life, but the damage was extensive. She had lost her job, and her once promising career was now in ruins. Her friends had distanced themselves, and her attempts to reconnect with former colleagues were met with cold indifference. I watched as she struggled, feeling a mix of guilt and detachment. The woman who had once been so vibrant was now a shell of her former self, consumed by shame and despair. Lucas, too, was grappling with the aftermath. His career was over, and he had become a pariah in his professional circles. The company where he had once been a rising star had publicly distanced itself from him, and his attempts to find new employment were met with rejection. His reputation was in tatters, and he was forced to confront the harsh reality of his actions. The strain on our relationship became evident in every interaction. Our conversations were terse, filled with accusations and blame. I found myself avoiding Sarah, unable to face the reality of what I had done. The sense of betrayal and anger that had initially driven me had now given way to a profound sense of guilt and regret. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the silence between us was palpable. Sarah finally broke it, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why did you do it, Brian? What did you hope to achieve?" I struggled to find an answer, my mind racing through the events that had led to this moment. "I wanted justice," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. "I wanted to make them pay for what they did." Sarah's eyes were filled with pain. "But did it make you feel any better? Did it fix anything?" I couldn't answer her. The truth was, nothing had been fixed. My quest for revenge had only led to more suffering for Sarah, for Lucas, and for myself. The satisfaction I had hoped to find had been elusive, replaced by a deep sense of emptiness. As Sarah and I continued to drift apart, I found myself seeking solace in the familiarity of my job. Work became a refuge, a place where I could escape from the turmoil at home. But even there, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was deeply wrong. The investigation into the breach continued, and the threat of legal consequences loomed over me. Though I had been careful to cover my tracks, the fear of being discovered was a constant presence. My old friend in law enforcement had warned me that the investigation was thorough, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth might come to light. In the midst of all this, I began to reflect on my actions. The initial thrill of revenge had been replaced by a stark realization of the damage I had caused. The lives I had disrupted were now a part of my own personal wreckage. The pursuit of justice had turned into a haunting reminder of the cost of my decisions. One night, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, I couldn't escape the feeling of isolation. The silence was overwhelming, and I realized that the damage I had done was far greater than I had anticipated. The relationships I had once valued were now broken, and the sense of vindication I had sought was nowhere to be found. The realization hit me hard. I had set out to punish Sarah and Lucas, but in doing so, I had punished myself as well. The path of revenge had led me to a place of profound regret, and I was left to confront the reality of the choices I had made. The quest for justice had become a burden, and I was left with nothing but the echoes of my own actions and the wreckage they had left behind. The days blended together as the reality of my actions settled in. I had hoped that time would heal the wounds and that life would somehow return to normal. But that was not to be. Every corner of our apartment felt like a reminder of the chaos I had unleashed. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating me with the weight of my decisions. Sarah had withdrawn even further into herself. She rarely left the apartment, and when she did, it was only for the bare necessities. The sparkle that once defined her was gone, replaced by a hollow, distant stare. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was usually a terse exchange or a heated argument that left both of us feeling more isolated than before. I tried to reach out to her, to offer support or comfort, but every attempt was met with resistance. The guilt I felt was overwhelming, and each day was a struggle to reconcile the person I had become with the man I used to be. The sense of justice I had sought now seemed like a distant fantasy, eclipsed by the reality of the damage I had caused. Lucas's situation was no better. He had retreated from the public eye, seeking refuge in anonymity. I occasionally saw him around town, a shadow of his former self. His attempts to rebuild his life had been met with failure after failure. The professional networks he once thrived in had turned their backs on him, and his personal life had become a series of humiliating setbacks. The legal proceedings surrounding the breach were a constant source of anxiety. The investigation was thorough, and the police seemed determined to uncover the truth. My old friend in law enforcement had warned me that the investigation was progressing, and I found myself constantly on edge, wondering if my actions would be discovered. One afternoon, as I sat alone at the kitchen table, the phone rang. It was a call from a lawyer, someone who had been retained to handle the legal aspects of the investigation. The lawyer's voice was calm but firm as he explained that there was a growing concern about the breach and that they were closing in on potential suspects. My heart raced as he mentioned the possibility of legal repercussions. The thought of facing criminal charges was a chilling one. I had been so consumed by my desire for revenge that I had failed to consider the potential consequences of my actions. Now, as the reality of legal trouble loomed, I was forced to confront the full scope of what I had done. In an effort to salvage what remained of my life, I sought help from a counselor. The sessions were uncomfortable and revealing, but they offered me a glimpse into the deeper issues driving my actions. I began to understand the destructive nature of my quest for vengeance and the personal demons that had fueled it. Sarah, too, reluctantly agreed to attend counseling. The sessions were tense, and progress was slow, but it was clear that she needed support to navigate the emotional fallout. We were both trying to rebuild our lives, but the process was fraught with difficulty and pain. As weeks turned into months, I began to see the long-term effects of my actions. Sarah and I were both damaged by the events, struggling to find a path forward. The relationships we had once valued were strained or severed, and the sense of vindication I had sought was replaced by a profound sense of loss. The investigation eventually reached a point where the authorities decided not to pursue criminal charges against me, but the relief was short-lived. The knowledge that I had come so close to facing serious legal consequences was a stark reminder of the cost of my actions. In the end, the quest for revenge had left me with more questions than answers. The initial satisfaction had been fleeting, and the consequences of my actions were far-reaching and painful. I was left to grapple with the reality of the choices I had made and the lasting impact they had on my life and the lives of those around me. As Sarah and I continued to navigate the aftermath, I realized that the path to redemption would be long and difficult. The damage had been done, and the road to recovery was fraught with challenges. The pursuit of justice had become a burden, and I was left to face the consequences of my actions with a deep sense of regret and a determination to make amends where possible. Time continued its relentless march, and the emotional landscape of my life was marked by a series of deep and painful changes. The cracks in my relationship with Sarah had become chasms, and the once familiar routines of our life together felt like echoes of a past that could never be reclaimed. Sarah and I had been through therapy sessions together, and though they provided some insights, the damage done was not easily repaired. We had lost the ability to communicate openly, and every conversation seemed to be a struggle. The trust that once bound us had been irrevocably shattered, and the emotional distance between us was growing wider. One evening, as I sat on the edge of our bed, I overheard Sarah on the phone with a close friend. Her voice was muffled, but the words, "Can't take this anymore," pierced through the walls. My heart sank as I realized how close we were to the breaking point. The following day, Sarah made a decision that was both inevitable and devastating. She announced that she wanted to move out and find a place of her own. The declaration felt like a knife to the heart. I knew that our relationship had been strained, but hearing her voice the finality of her decision was a harsh reminder of how far we had fallen. The process of packing up her belongings was surreal. The apartment, once filled with shared memories and laughter, now felt like a battleground. Each item she packed seemed to represent a piece of the life we had lost. There was a profound sadness in watching her prepare to leave, and a part of me wanted to stop her. To fix everything and make it right. But deep down, I knew that the damage was too extensive to mend easily. As Sarah moved out, the apartment felt emptier than ever. The silence was oppressive, and the reality of our separation began to sink in. I was left alone with my thoughts, grappling with the fallout of my actions and the loss of a relationship that had once been central to my life. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and I had minimal contact. The conversations we did have were tense and filled with unresolved emotions. The reality of our situation was becoming clearer. The relationship we had known was over, and the future was uncertain. The weight of the breakup and the consequences of my actions were heavy burdens to bear. Despite the breakup, I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy in my daily life. I threw myself into work, hoping that the routine and structure would provide some relief from the emotional turmoil. But even at work, I found it difficult to escape the lingering sense of guilt and regret. The ripple effects of our separation were felt beyond just the two of us. Friends and family members reached out with expressions of sympathy and concern, but their well-meaning words did little to ease the pain. The support I received felt inadequate in the face of the magnitude of what had transpired. As the months went by, I began to see glimpses of hope for personal growth and healing. I continued my counseling sessions, and the process of self-reflection was gradually helping me come to terms with my actions. I was learning to accept responsibility for the consequences of my decisions and to understand the deeper issues that had driven me. The end of my relationship with Sarah marked a significant turning point in my life. It was a painful reminder of the cost of seeking revenge and the toll it had taken on those around me. Though the path to healing was still uncertain, I was beginning to grasp the importance of facing the consequences of my actions and working toward personal redemption. In the midst of the pain and loss, I found myself slowly starting to rebuild my life. The journey was far from over, and the scars of the past were still fresh, but I was determined to move forward with a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to making amends where possible. The shattered relationship with Sarah was a painful chapter, but it was also a catalyst for change, leading me to confront the consequences of my actions and seek a path to personal growth and healing. As the months passed, I found myself grappling with the aftermath of my actions and the deep sense of regret that accompanied them. The pain of the breakup with Sarah and the fallout from the scandal had created a profound shift in my perspective. I had hoped that time would heal the wounds, but instead, it had given me space to reflect on the full extent of what I had done. I continued attending counseling, and while the sessions were often uncomfortable, they provided me with valuable insights into my own behavior. I began to understand the driving forces behind my quest for revenge and the underlying insecurities that had fueled it. The sessions were a slow process of unraveling the layers of my actions and emotions, but they were essential for my healing. The apartment felt like a constant reminder of the past. I began to make small changes, trying to transform the space into something that reflected the new phase of my life. I rearranged furniture, redecorated, and cleared out items that held painful memories. The physical changes were a way of symbolically moving forward, though the emotional journey was far from complete. One evening, as I sat alone on the balcony, I watched the city lights twinkle in the distance. The quiet of the night was a stark contrast to the turmoil I had experienced over the past year. It was in these moments of solitude that I confronted the full weight of my actions. I reflected on the choices I had made and the impact they had had on Sarah, Lucas, and myself. The realization of the irreversible damage I had caused was sobering. I had set out to punish Sarah and Lucas for their betrayal, but in doing so, I had inflicted pain on everyone involved, including myself. The sense of vindication I had hoped for had been replaced by a deep, unshakable remorse. I reached out to Lucas, hoping to find some resolution. It was a difficult decision, but I wanted to offer an apology and acknowledge the role I had played in his downfall. The meeting was tense, but it was also an opportunity for both of us to express our regrets and seek some form of closure. Lucas and I sat across from each other in a small cafe. His face was etched with the marks of the past few months, and his eyes held a mixture of anger and sadness. I began by acknowledging my actions and the pain they had caused him. It was an uncomfortable conversation, but it was also an important step in my process of atonement. "I'm truly sorry for what I did," I said, my voice wavering. "I let my anger and hurt take over, and I didn't consider the consequences for you or anyone else." Lucas listened, his expression guarded. After a long silence, he responded, "I appreciate the apology, Brian, but it doesn't erase what happened. I've lost a lot because of what you did." We spoke for a while longer, sharing our thoughts and feelings. While there were no easy answers or quick fixes, the conversation was a step toward understanding and, perhaps, some form of reconciliation. It was a small but significant moment in my journey toward making amends. As I continued to work on my personal growth, I also made an effort to reconnect with friends and family. I reached out to those I had pushed away during the turmoil, seeking their support and trying to rebuild damaged relationships. The process was slow, and not everyone was willing to forgive or forget, but I was determined to make a sincere effort. I also began volunteering with local organizations, using my skills to help others. The work was fulfilling and provided a sense of purpose that had been missing for a long time. It was a way to give back and to start healing from the inside out. The journey of reflection and self-improvement was ongoing. I knew that the road to redemption was long and that the scars of the past would not easily fade. But with each step forward, I was learning to accept responsibility for my actions and to strive for a better future. As I looked back on the past year, I saw a story of pain, regret, and growth. The quest for revenge had led to a series of profound changes in my life, and while the journey was far from over, I was beginning to find a sense of hope amidst the ruins. The reflection on my actions and their consequences was a crucial part of moving forward, and I was committed to continuing the path toward healing and self-discovery. As the year progressed, I found myself at a crossroads. The journey through regret and reflection had led me to a crucial point: the need to seek redemption and rebuild my life. The pain of the past was still fresh, but I was determined to move forward and make amends where possible. I started by focusing on self-improvement and healing. My counseling sessions became a cornerstone of my routine, providing me with tools to manage my emotions and understand my behavior. I was learning to navigate my feelings of guilt and regret and to approach life with a renewed sense of purpose. One of the most important steps I took was to reconnect with Sarah. Though our relationship was irreparably changed, I wanted to find some way to offer her closure and acknowledge the harm I had caused. I reached out to her with a letter, expressing my sincere apologies and offering to meet if she was willing. To my surprise, Sarah agreed to meet. We chose a neutral location, a quiet park where we could talk without the pressures of our former home. The meeting was emotionally charged, but it was also a chance to address the pain between us. As we sat on a park bench, I began by apologizing again, this time with a deep sense of remorse. "Sarah, I know that no words can undo what I've done. I'm deeply sorry for the hurt and damage I've caused you. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Sarah listened quietly, her face reflecting a mix of emotions. After a moment, she responded, "Brian, hearing you say that means a lot. It doesn't change what happened, but it does help to know that you understand the impact of your actions." Our conversation was heartfelt and open. We spoke about our past, our regrets, and our hopes for the future. While it was clear that we would never return to what we once had, the meeting provided a sense of closure and a step toward healing for both of us. In addition to making amends with Sarah, I continued to work on rebuilding my relationships with friends and family. The support of those who had remained in my life was invaluable. I reached out to those I had alienated, and while some were open to reconnecting, others remained distant. I respected their boundaries and understood that rebuilding trust would take time. Volunteering became a significant part of my life. I dedicated my time to helping others, using my skills to make a positive impact in the community. The work was fulfilling and provided a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. It was my way of giving back and finding redemption through acts of service. The legal issues related to the breach were eventually resolved without criminal charges, but the experience left a lasting impression. The investigation had been a constant source of stress, and the relief of avoiding legal repercussions was tempered by the knowledge of the harm I had caused. As I continued my path to redemption, I focused on personal growth and self-improvement. I attended workshops on emotional intelligence and conflict resolution, seeking to better understand myself and improve my relationships. The journey was challenging, but it was also rewarding. One day, as I looked back on the past year, I realized that the road to redemption was not just about seeking forgiveness from others but also about forgiving myself. I had come to understand that the journey was as much about self-acceptance as it was about making amends. The process of healing was ongoing, but I felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose. The story of my past year was one of pain, regret, and growth. The quest for revenge had led me to confront my own flaws and the consequences of my actions. While the path to redemption was far from over, I was committed to moving forward with integrity and a commitment to positive change. In the end, the road to redemption was not just about repairing the damage I had caused but also about finding a way to live with myself and my choices. It was a journey of self-discovery and transformation, and while the scars of the past would always remain, I was determined to build a future defined by growth, compassion, and hope. Just when I thought I had reached a turning point, life threw another unexpected curveball my way. It had been a year since everything fell apart, and I had worked hard to rebuild myself. I was focused on moving forward, but the past has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. It started with an email, an unassuming message that landed in my inbox late one afternoon. I was at work, buried in routine tasks, when I saw it. A message from someone I hadn't heard from in a long time. The subject line read, "We need to talk." My heart skipped a beat. The email was from a former coworker of Lucas and Sarah. The name was familiar, but we had never been close. The message itself was short, direct. "Brian, I think you should know something. Lucas has been talking to people about you. He's been telling his version of what happened, and it's not painting you in a good light. You might want to be careful." Words getting around in professional circles. "Thought you should know." I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Lucas? What more could he possibly want? He had lost everything: his job, his reputation, his standing in the company. The last time we spoke, it seemed like he was as much of a wreck as I was. Why would he still be talking about me, and what was he saying? That night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the email left me with. I didn't want to care. But I did. The thought that Lucas was spreading stories about me was unsettling. The damage I'd caused had been substantial, but now it seemed like he wasn't content to let it go. He was determined to drag me down even further. The next day, I received a phone call from a former colleague, someone I hadn't spoken to since everything went down. "Brian," they started cautiously, "I've heard a few things. People are starting to wonder if you had a hand in leaking the emails last year. There's been talk, and not all of it's flattering." It hit me like a ton of bricks. Lucas must have been spreading rumors, trying to shift the blame and paint me as some sort of villain. I wasn't exactly innocent, but I had taken responsibility. I had faced my mistakes, and now it felt like I was being dragged back into the mess I'd been working so hard to move past. Suddenly, my past actions weren't just haunting me. They were actively threatening to undo everything I had rebuilt. The idea that Lucas might be trying to exact his own form of revenge had never occurred to me. But it made sense. He had been humiliated, and now he was making his move, trying to destroy what little I had left. For the next few days, I couldn't concentrate. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if Lucas convinced more people to turn against me? What if his story gained traction and people believed his twisted version of events? The irony wasn't lost on me. The same tactic I had used to bring him down, exposing private information, was now being turned against me. though in a much more insidious way. I decided to confront him. I couldn't let this spiral out of control without at least trying to set things straight. I reached out, asking him to meet. To my surprise, he agreed. We met at a coffee shop outside of town. Lucas looked different, thinner, more ragged, but his eyes still had that same sharp edge. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "So, you heard," he said, leaning back in his chair, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "I did," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Why are you doing this, Lucas? Haven't we both been through enough?" Lucas shrugged. "Maybe, but you ruined my life, Brian. You think I'm just going to sit back and let you walk away like nothing happened? You ruined your own life. You and Sarah, you were the ones who betrayed me." I paused, realizing how hollow the justification sounded. "I just made sure everyone saw the truth." Lucas laughed, a bitter, joyless sound. "The truth? That's what you call it?" "No, Brian, you destroyed me because you were angry. Because you wanted to hurt me. And you succeeded. But you didn't think there would be consequences for you?" I was at a loss. It was true that my actions had been driven by anger, but I had owned that. I had paid the price, lost Sarah, nearly faced legal consequences, spent months rebuilding. But Lucas wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted more. "I'm trying to move on, Lucas," I said quietly. "Why can't you?" "Because I have nothing left to lose," he replied, leaning forward. "And I want to make sure you lose everything, too." The threat hung in the air between us. Lucas wasn't just out for revenge. He was out for total destruction, and I was his target. He had been waiting, biding his time, and now he was making his move. As I walked away from that meeting, I realized something chilling: this wasn't over. The revenge I had thought was complete had only sparked another round of consequences. Lucas had turned the tables, and now I was the one living in fear of what might come next. The past wasn't done with me yet. The encounter with Lucas left me shaken. I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath me was starting to crumble again, this time in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the fear of rumors spreading, it was the creeping realization that the consequences of my actions were far from over. The revenge I had sought was now returning to haunt me, and I was losing control of the narrative. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in my life escalated. At work, I noticed a shift in the way people interacted with me, casual conversations cut short. Glances exchanged when I walked by, and hushed whispers behind closed doors. I tried to ignore it, but it gnawed at me, making me question whether Lucas's campaign to discredit me was working. Was I being paranoid, or was something real brewing beneath the surface? One morning, I received a phone call from my boss. His tone was formal, almost too careful. "Brian, we need to have a meeting. Can you come into my office later today?" I hung up, my heart pounding. It didn't feel like an ordinary meeting. He said, choosing his words carefully. "People are questioning whether you had a hand in leaking those emails. Lucas has been reaching out to some of our clients, suggesting that there's more to the story than what was publicly known." I clenched my fists under the table, trying to suppress the rising panic. Lucas's whispers were starting to spread like wildfire, and now my professional reputation was on the line. I had tried to move past this, to rebuild, but it seemed Lucas wasn't going to let that happen. "Those rumors aren't true," I said, my voice firm but tinged with desperation. "Yes, I was involved with the fallout, but I didn't leak those emails to clients or anyone outside the company. I've already faced the consequences for my actions." My boss sighed, rubbing his temples. "I believe you, Brian. But it's not just about what I believe. The rumors are affecting how people see you here. It's creating a toxic environment, and I need to address that." The implication was clear: my position was in jeopardy. Even if I hadn't leaked the emails to clients, the mere suggestion that I might have was enough to cast a long shadow over my career. My actions, once driven by anger and vengeance, were now threatening to undo everything I had worked for. Lucas's plan to destroy me was taking shape. "I'm going to have to put you on temporary leave while we conduct a review," my boss continued. "I'm sorry, but it's the only way we can get to the bottom of this without further disruption." I nodded, numb. The walls were closing in, and I had no choice but to comply. As I left the office, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. My life was spiraling out of control again, and this time, I wasn't sure I could pull myself out. The days that followed were a blur. With no job to distract me, I spent hours in my apartment, replaying the events of the past year in my mind. I was consumed by thoughts of Lucas, how he had managed to turn the tables so effectively, how he was using the same tactics I had once used against him. The irony was sickening. I had become the victim of my own vengeful actions, trapped in a cycle I couldn't escape. I tried to reach out to people who might still believe in me, former colleagues, friends, even Sarah. But the responses were distant, guarded. The rumors were spreading fast, and it was clear that people were starting to doubt me. I couldn't blame them. My past actions had left a stain, and Lucas's campaign was making sure that stain couldn't be easily washed away. One evening, as I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. "How does it feel to lose everything, Brian?" I knew it was from Lucas. The message hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't content with just taking down my career. He wanted to see me suffer, to make sure I felt the same pain he had felt when I exposed him and Sarah. He was relishing this, and it was working. I threw the phone across the room in frustration, watching as it clattered against the wall and fell to the floor. My mind was racing. How had it come to this? I had wanted justice, to make Sarah and Lucas pay for their betrayal, but now it seemed like the universe was serving me the same cruel fate. My revenge had become a curse, and I was paying the price. As I sat there in the silence of my apartment, I realized something. This wasn't just about Lucas. This was about the choices I had made. I had unleashed a storm, and now I was trapped in its aftermath. The cycle of vengeance wasn't just tearing Lucas down, it was destroying me as well. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could stop it. After days of spiraling into paranoia and regret, something snapped inside me. I couldn't sit in the darkness anymore, letting Lucas manipulate my life from the shadows. The constant fear, the whispers, the waiting, it had to end. I was done being the passive victim in a game I had started. If Lucas wanted a war, then I would give him one. But this time, it wouldn't be a rash, emotional decision like the first. No, I had learned my lesson from that disaster. If I was going to stop Lucas, I needed to be smarter than him. I needed to get ahead of whatever he was planning and take control of the situation before he completely ruined me. I wasn't going to lose everything because of him. I started by carefully analyzing every piece of information I had. I went through old emails, texts, and documents, piecing together the timeline of events that had led me to this point. The truth was, I had left a digital trail back then, but so had Lucas. His actions weren't squeaky clean either. And I knew there had to be something I could use. Everyone leaves evidence, even if they think they're being careful. After hours of digging, I found it. A message from Lucas to Sarah, buried deep in an old email thread. It wasn't explicit, but it hinted at some shady dealings at their company, cutting corners, overlooking serious issues to meet deadlines. It wasn't much, but I knew that in the right hands, it could raise some serious red flags. I also remembered that Lucas, in his desperation after the fallout, had reached out to me for help fixing some issues in his personal systems. In hindsight, I had been too wrapped up in my own misery to notice the potential leverage that gave me. I still had access to some of his old accounts, ones he had clearly forgotten about. For days, I worked in silence, methodically gathering everything I needed. It was like a twisted puzzle, pieces falling into place as I combed through data, connecting dots Lucas never imagined I could. I knew I couldn't strike without precision. This time, the damage had to be clean and definitive. Finally, when I had enough, I contacted someone I trusted, a former coworker who had seen the fallout between Lucas, Sarah, and me but had stayed neutral. He had insider knowledge of our company's workings and knew how to make the right information reach the right people. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to pique his interest and get him on my side. A few well-placed tips about Lucas's shady dealings were all it took. Once the information made its way to the right hands, it would be out of my control, and Lucas would have no idea it was coming from me. I wasn't about to make the same mistake twice by exposing myself. This would be a silent strike, a cold and calculated takedown. I felt a dark satisfaction creep over me as the plan unfolded. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to Lucas, I was taking control again. I knew it was risky, but at this point, there wasn't much left to lose. He had pushed me to the edge, and now it was his turn to fall. A few days later, the first crack appeared. I received a message from my contact. "You won't believe what I'm hearing. People are starting to dig into Lucas's role in some project failures. There's going to be an internal investigation. It's not looking good for him. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Lucas had been so focused on tearing me down, he never saw this coming. The investigation would do its work, and eventually, his reputation would crumble under the weight of his own actions. No one would have to know I had played a role in his downfall. It was all happening in the background, just as I had planned. But the momentary victory didn't come without its own costs. As much as I tried to distance myself from the chaos, the guilt lingered. I told myself that Lucas deserved it, that he had brought this on himself, but deep down, I knew I had crossed another line. This wasn't just about evening the score anymore, it was about destruction. And destruction leaves scars, no matter how justified it feels in the moment. As the days passed, I watched from the sidelines as Lucas's world began to unravel. His name was being dragged into company politics, his past actions scrutinized by people he once trusted. It was happening slowly, methodically, just like I wanted. But instead of the satisfaction I thought I'd feel, there was only a hollow ache. I had won the battle, but at what cost? Late one night, as I sat in my apartment, staring at the screen, I felt a sudden wave of exhaustion. The kind that seeps into your bones when you've been fighting for too long. I thought back to how this all started, with a betrayal I thought I couldn't recover from. And now here I was, months later, trapped in the same cycle of vengeance that had consumed Lucas and me from the beginning. It wasn't over. Not really. Not until I decided to walk away from it all. But could I? Could I really stop? I wasn't sure anymore. The line between justice and revenge had blurred long ago, and now I was left standing in the wreckage, wondering if I'd ever find my way out. And as much as I wanted to believe that this was the end, I knew deep down that it wasn't. Not yet. A few weeks passed, and the tension in the air grew heavier. Lucas's downfall was no longer a secret whispered among the shadows. It had become public, a spectacle of professional disgrace that rippled through the company. I watched it unfold from the sidelines, trying to distance myself emotionally, but I couldn't help but feel the weight of what I'd set in motion. It started with an internal memo leaked to all employees, announcing an investigation into mismanagement and ethical violations tied to projects Lucas had overseen. His name wasn't mentioned directly, but everyone knew. The memo outlined a list of concerns: financial discrepancies, unsafe work practices, and a toxic work environment. These were the same projects Lucas had boasted about during his affair with Megan, the ones he had bent the rules on to meet deadlines and keep the company happy. But now, those shortcuts were coming back to haunt him, and the company had no choice but to take action. It wasn't long before people were openly talking about how Lucas had been the one responsible for several costly mistakes. Word spread fast. The office grapevine turned vicious. As everyone speculated about how deep the rot went, I couldn't deny the dark sense of satisfaction that bloomed inside me. For the first time in months, Lucas was no longer in control. The smug confidence he'd wielded like a weapon was gone. He was drowning in the consequences of his own ambition, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But even as I watched him fall, I felt a creeping unease. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, knowing you were the one who cut the brakes. I had always justified my actions as retaliation, as taking back the power that had been stolen from me. But this was something else. The damage was spreading beyond Lucas now. People who had worked under him were getting caught in the crossfire, and the company itself was starting to fracture under the weight of the investigation. And I knew that, sooner or later, someone would start asking questions. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk, my phone buzzed with a text from Megan. "You hearing about Lucas? It's bad. People are saying he might get fired. He's losing it." I stared at the message for a moment, unsure how to respond. Megan had always kept her distance from the drama, but now even she couldn't ignore what was happening. She had been friends with Lucas, though not close enough to get tangled in his mess. Still, it was clear she knew something was up. Before I could reply, another text came through. "Are you okay?" I hesitated. Was I okay? The thrill of revenge was starting to wear off, replaced by something more complicated. The satisfaction I had felt watching Lucas squirm was fading, leaving behind a hollow space I didn't know how to fill. I had wanted him to suffer, to feel the same pain he had inflicted on me, but now that it was happening, I wasn't sure if it was enough. Or maybe it was too much. I typed out a quick response: "I'm fine. Just keeping my head down." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. I wasn't fine. I was restless, caught between the victory I had worked so hard for and the nagging feeling that this wasn't how things were supposed to go. Lucas had deserved what was coming to him, but at what point did revenge become something more destructive? And how far was I willing to go to keep my own hands clean? As the fallout from the investigation grew, the atmosphere in the office became more volatile. People were scrambling to distance themselves from Lucas, hoping to avoid being dragged down with him. I watched as his once loyal team turned against him, throwing him under the bus to save their own careers. It was brutal, and yet, part of me couldn't look away. Then, the inevitable happened. Lucas was called into a meeting with HR and the higher-ups. By the end of the day, everyone knew he was gone. Fired. Disgraced. The man who had once been so sure of his place in the company was now a pariah, cut off from the career he had spent years building. I thought that moment would feel like a victory. After all, wasn't this what I had wanted? To see Lucas pay for what he'd done to me, to Sarah, to all the people he'd used along the way. But standing there, watching him leave the building with a box of his belongings, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Lucas had lost everything: his job, his reputation, and now his future. He had no one to turn to, no friends left to defend him. Even Sarah, who had once been his closest ally, had distanced herself from him. In the end, he was alone, just like I had been when this all started. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head. The messages, the emails, the steps I had taken to make sure Lucas's downfall was inevitable. I thought about how easy it had been to manipulate the situation, to pull the right strings and watch him unravel. But now that it was over, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Had I gone too far? The question echoed in my mind, louder than I wanted to admit. I had always told myself that Lucas deserved it, that this was justice. But now that it was done, I wasn't sure if I could keep believing that lie. Revenge had consumed me, blinded me to the damage I was causing. And now, with Lucas gone, I was left with the wreckage of a war one had started. But there was no turning back now. The fallout had only just begun. The fallout hit me harder than I expected. Watching Lucas walk out of the building for the last time had left me feeling conflicted. I thought I'd feel triumphant, like I had won something important, but the emptiness that followed was unbearable. I had destroyed him, sure, but in doing so, I had destroyed a part of myself too. Days passed in a blur. I kept my head down at work, avoiding conversations and focusing on the mundane tasks that filled my time. My coworkers were still talking about Lucas's sudden exit, how someone had leaked information about his shady practices, how the investigation had uncovered more than anyone expected. But no one knew the full truth, and I wasn't about to offer any explanations. I was in the middle of answering emails one afternoon when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat. For a second, I thought it might be Lucas, some last-ditch attempt to reach out before he vanished completely. But it wasn't. "We need to talk. Tonight. You know where." I knew who it was immediately: Sarah. We hadn't spoken in months, not since the day I had confronted her about the affair with Lucas. Since then, she had disappeared from my life, probably hoping to avoid the chaos that followed. But now she was back, and from the tone of her message, it wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. I stared at the screen, debating whether or not to respond. Part of me didn't want to see her, didn't want to face the person who had shattered my world. But the other part, the part that needed closure, knew I couldn't avoid this forever. I had to confront her, to face whatever was coming. That evening, I found myself standing outside the cafe where we had once shared coffee and casual conversations, back when things were simpler, back when I still trusted her. The place felt foreign now, like a relic from a past life I barely recognized. I spotted her at a corner table, her face tense and her fingers tapping nervously on the wooden surface. She looked up as I approached, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of anger and something else, regret, maybe? "Brian," she said quietly, motioning for me to sit. I slid into the chair opposite her, the tension between us palpable. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence thick and uncomfortable. "I heard about Lucas," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what happened." I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't sure how much she knew or how she had pieced it together, but I had a feeling this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. "Yeah, I'm sure you've heard a lot," I said, my tone colder than I intended. Sarah looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. I don't know how much of it is true, but I know it wasn't just some random investigation. I know you had something to do with it. Her words hung in the air, an accusation I couldn't deny. I had expected this moment, but now that it was here, I felt exposed. What do you want me to say, Sarah? I asked, my voice low. That I did it? That I made sure Lucas got what he deserved? Because yeah, I did. I made sure everyone knew what kind of person he really was. I wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. She flinched at my words, her eyes narrowing. So it wasn't enough to destroy our marriage? You had to destroy his life too? I laughed bitterly. Our marriage was already destroyed. You and Lucas made sure of that. Don't act like I'm the villain here, Sarah. You lied to me. You betrayed me. I just made sure you both paid for it. For a moment, she looked like she was going to argue, but then something shifted in her expression. The anger drained from her face, replaced by exhaustion. I know, she said quietly. I know I hurt you, Brian. And I'm sorry. I've been sorry for a long time. I wasn't sure if I believed her. But hearing the words still hit me in a way I didn't expect. I had spent so long resenting her, blaming her for everything, that I hadn't allowed myself to even consider that she might feel guilty too. I didn't come here to fight, Sarah continued, her voice shaky. I came here because I wanted to try and make things right. I know we can't go back, and I know I can't undo what I did. But I never wanted things to end like this. I never wanted you to become this. She gestured vaguely at me. And I knew what she meant. The person sitting across from her wasn't the Brian she had married. I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. Revenge had consumed me, and now I was left with the wreckage. I didn't want to become this either, I admitted, my voice softening. But after everything that happened, I didn't know how else to deal with it. I wanted to hurt you the way you hurt me. And I did. But now, I don't know. Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't think it would get this bad. I didn't think Lucas. She stopped, biting her lip as if realizing that talking about him wasn't helping. I was selfish. I know that. I was stupid. And I'm paying for it too. For a long moment, we just sat there, the weight of everything that had happened between us pressing down on both of us. The anger, the betrayal, the revenge, it was all there, simmering beneath the surface. But something else was there too. A shared understanding, maybe even a shared regret. What happens now? I asked, breaking the silence. Sarah wiped her eyes and sighed. I don't know. I'm trying to move on, Brian. I think you should too. Holding on to all this anger, it's destroying you. I can see it. I wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't get to lecture me after everything she had done. But deep down, I knew she was right. The revenge, the plotting, the anger, it had all taken a toll on me, one I hadn't fully realized until now. Maybe you're right, I said finally. But I don't know how to move on from this. I don't know if I even can. Sarah reached across the table, her hand brushing mine lightly. You can, Brian. It's not going to be easy, but you can. We both can. For the first time in months, I let myself believe that might be true. As I left the cafe that night, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated, but for the first time in a long time, I felt something else. A glimmer of hope. The days following my conversation with Sarah were strangely quiet. After months of living with constant tension, scheming, and anger, the absence of chaos left a void. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of revenge pressing down on my chest. But that didn't mean I had fully moved on. Closure with Sarah was one thing, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Lucas's downfall than I had anticipated. My actions had set the wheels in motion, but something about the speed and intensity of his crash seemed too convenient. It was as if someone else had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. I couldn't let it go. Even after I promised Sarah, and myself, that I would move on, the nagging suspicion wouldn't leave me alone. So, late one night, unable to sleep, I found myself back at my computer, digging through the same digital trail I had used to take Lucas down. I hadn't touched the files since I'd sent them to my contact, but now I felt compelled to look again, to see if there was something I missed. I opened the encrypted folder and started scrolling through the emails, messages, and documents I had collected. It was a slow, methodical process, but the more I read, the more uneasy I felt. The data was all there. Lucas's shady practices, the corners he'd cut, the unethical decisions, but something didn't add up. I noticed a string of emails from a familiar name, David Caldwell. David had been Lucas's boss, the man who had always covered for him whenever things went wrong. I had written him off as just another corporate suit, too concerned with profits to care about the details. But now, reading through these emails, I saw something I hadn't seen before. David wasn't just covering for Lucas. He was actively involved in the same shady dealings. The messages were subtle, but they were there. David had been the one approving Lucas's risky decisions, encouraging him to push boundaries to meet deadlines, all while making sure the blame never fell on him. Lucas had been a pawn, manipulated by someone higher up the chain, someone who had a lot more to lose if the truth ever came out. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. This changed everything. Lucas wasn't the mastermind I had made him out to be. He was just another cog in a much bigger machine. And David had been the one pulling the strings all along, making sure Lucas took the fall while he stayed clean. Suddenly, it all made sense. The investigation had moved too quickly, the evidence had been too easy to find. David must have known Lucas would get caught eventually, so he'd made sure the investigation pointed in one direction only. Lucas was the perfect scapegoat, and I had unknowingly played right into David's hands. Anger surged through me. I had been so focused on Lucas, so blinded by my need for revenge, that I hadn't seen the bigger picture. David was the real villain here, and he had gotten away with it while Lucas had lost everything. I clenched my fists, feeling the familiar burn of rage creeping back in. I couldn't let this go. Not now. Not after everything. But as much as I wanted to take David down, I knew I had to be careful. He wasn't like Lucas, he was smarter, more calculated. If I went after him directly, he'd see it coming. I needed a different approach, something more subtle. I leaned forward, typing quickly as a new plan started to form in my mind. If David thought he had gotten away with it, he was wrong. He had used me once, but this time, I was going to be the one pulling the strings. I spent the next few hours gathering as much information on David as I could. I searched through company records, combed through financial documents, and cross-referenced emails from old projects. The deeper I dug, the more I realized just how deeply David's hands were in everything. By the time the sun started to rise, I had a plan. It wasn't going to be easy, and it would take time, but I knew what I had to do. David had made the mistake of underestimating me, just like Lucas had. He thought he was untouchable, that his position of power made him invincible. But I had learned something over the past few months. No one is untouchable. Everyone has a weakness, a vulnerability. And I was going to find David's. As I shut my computer and stood up, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. David had manipulated people, destroyed lives, and used Lucas as a shield to protect himself. Now, it was time for him to face the consequences. I walked to the window and looked out at the city below, the streets still quiet in the early morning light. I had no idea how this would end, but one thing was clear, I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The next few days passed in a blur of careful planning. I knew David was sharp, calculating, and ruthless when it came to protecting his interests. He had built his career on staying one step ahead of everyone, using people like Lucas to take the heat when things went wrong. If I was going to take him down, I couldn't afford any mistakes. I started by going back through every file I had on Lucas. The information I had already used to destroy him was still useful, but this time, I was looking for any thread that tied back to David. I spent hours sifting through emails, meeting notes, and project updates, looking for patterns and connections I hadn't noticed before. It was tedious work, but slowly, a clearer picture started to emerge. David wasn't just covering for Lucas, he had been involved in every major decision, every risky move. Whenever Lucas pushed a project forward without proper oversight, David had given the green light. And when those decisions backfired, David made sure the blame fell squarely on Lucas. It was a classic case of corporate maneuvering, and I knew that if I could expose the full extent of David's involvement, it would ruin him. But I needed more than just old emails. I needed something concrete, something that would implicate David directly. And I knew exactly where to start. David wasn't the type to leave a paper trail, but like most corporate sharks, he was greedy. If I could find financial records that showed how he'd personally benefited from the shady projects Lucas had spearheaded, it would be game over for him. I logged into my company's internal network, using the same techniques I had relied on to dig up dirt on Lucas. This time, though, I was after David's personal files. It took a few hours of searching, but I finally found what I was looking for, a series of encrypted folders buried deep in the company's financial records. They were password protected, but that wasn't a problem for me. With a few keystrokes, I bypassed the encryption and started combing through the files. My heart raced as I scrolled through spreadsheets, invoices, and transaction logs. At first, nothing jumped out at me. David had been careful, hiding his tracks well. But then I found it. Buried in a folder labeled bonuses was a set of payments that didn't make sense. Large sums of money, funneled through shell companies, all tied to the same projects Lucas had overseen. The payments were listed as performance bonuses, but the amounts were far beyond what anyone in David's position should have been receiving. And they all lined up with the timeline of Lucas's riskiest projects, the ones that had nearly sunk the company. I couldn't believe my luck. This was exactly what I needed. David had been using Lucas as a pawn to push through high-risk, high-reward projects, reaping the financial benefits while Lucas took the fall whenever things went south. And now, I had the proof, but I wasn't going to release this information yet. Not until I had set the stage. If I acted too soon, David would bury everything, and I'd lose my chance. I needed to make sure there was no way out for him. That's when I decided to bait the trap. The next day at work, I made sure to keep things business as usual. I didn't want to raise any suspicion. David and I rarely crossed paths, but I knew he kept tabs on everyone in the office, especially after Lucas's departure. He was probably feeling more paranoid than ever, and I planned to use that to my advantage. I started by planting rumors. Casual conversations with a few key people in the office, nothing too obvious, but just enough to suggest that more layoffs might be coming, that the investigation into Lucas wasn't quite over. I dropped hints about new leadership changes, murmured about a possible audit of senior management. The office buzzed with speculation within days. People were on edge, whispering about who might be next to go. And I knew it was only a matter of time before word reached David. Sure enough, the following week, I got a call to meet him in his office. As I walked down the hallway, I could feel the adrenaline kicking in. This was it, the first move in a much larger game. When I stepped into David's office, he was sitting behind his desk, his face as unreadable as ever. "Brian," he said, motioning for me to sit. "I've been hearing some things around the office. Thought it would be best if we had a little chat." I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I could feel the tension building. "Sure, what's on your mind?" David leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment before speaking. "There's been a lot of speculation lately. People talking about the investigation into Lucas, wondering if there's more to it. I'm sure you've heard the rumors." I nodded, playing along. "Yeah, people are nervous. With Lucas gone, everyone's wondering who's next." David's eyes narrowed slightly. "Exactly. And I've noticed you've been engaged in quite a few conversations recently. More than usual." I met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Just doing my job, David. Trying to keep things running smoothly." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course. But I think we both know that this company has a lot at stake right now. The last thing we need is more instability." I could tell he was fishing, trying to gauge how much I knew. He didn't suspect me, yet, but he was clearly on edge. "Agreed," I said calmly. "That's why I'm doing everything I can to keep people focused. We don't need any more distractions." David nodded, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. "Good. Keep it that way." As I left his office, I felt a surge of satisfaction. David was already nervous, which meant my plan was working. I had planted the seeds of doubt, and now all I had to do was wait for him to make a mistake. The trap was set, and soon, David Caldwell would fall just like Lucas had. But this time, I wouldn't stop until he was completely destroyed. The tension at work escalated over the next few weeks. My little rumor mill had worked better than expected. People were uneasy, watching their backs, and it didn't take long for the paranoia to spread through the ranks. David must have felt it too. He started acting differently. He was more distant, but I could sense his eyes on me, always trying to gauge what I knew, what I was up to. He didn't trust me anymore. That much was clear, but I didn't need his trust. All I needed was for him to slip, to make one wrong move, and the whole carefully crafted facade he'd built would come crumbling down. Late one evening, when most of the office had cleared out, I was working on my next step. I'd created a false financial discrepancy in one of the company's project files, Something subtle but big enough to catch David's attention if he was keeping tabs on the accounts like I suspected. The idea was to lure him into fixing the problem, thinking he could sweep it under the rug before anyone noticed. It was a delicate balance, one wrong move, and the trap would be too obvious. But I knew David's type. He couldn't resist controlling everything, especially when it came to money. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. The digital breadcrumbs were perfectly placed. Now, I just had to wait. A couple of days later, the crack I'd been waiting for finally appeared. It started with an email from one of the accounting clerks, a small discrepancy she had noticed in a project's financial report. The exact discrepancy I had planted. She had sent it to David, who forwarded it to me with a vague instruction to handle it quietly. This was it. David had taken the bait. I played along, replying professionally and promising to resolve the issue without raising any alarms. But what David didn't know was that I had already linked that small discrepancy to a series of larger, more incriminating transactions, hidden bonuses and payouts tied directly to him. The false problem I'd created was a smokescreen, covering up the real issue that David was desperate to conceal. Over the next few days, I watched as he scrambled to cover his tracks. I could almost see the panic in his curt emails, the late-night login attempts as he tried to erase any trace of the suspicious payments. But with each step he took, he only dug himself deeper. And I was watching everything. It wasn't long before I had exactly what I needed, a digital trail of evidence tying David to multiple fraudulent transactions. He had been siphoning money from the company for years, hiding it under the guise of performance bonuses, just like the ones Lucas had received. But now I had proof, and there was no way he could explain it away. The next step was to figure out how to use it. I could go straight to HR, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. David had been at the company for years, and his influence ran deep. He had friends in high places, people who would try to protect him once the truth came out. No, I needed something more public, something that would make it impossible for him to weasel his way out of this. That's when the idea hit me. I could do the same thing I had done to Lucas, who had hinted at shady practices but never had the evidence to back it up. I shared what I had found, making sure to emphasize that this was more than just another corporate scandal. This was fraud, and it was going to bring down the company if it wasn't stopped. They were hesitant at first, scared of what might happen if they went up against someone as influential as David. But once they saw the documents, once they understood the depth of his deception, they were on board. Together, we devised a plan. We would leak the evidence slowly, starting with anonymous tips to the company's internal audit team. Once the investigation started, we would push the information further, leaking it to key figures in the media, ensuring that it became a public scandal before David had a chance to bury it. It was risky, but it was the only way to ensure that David faced real consequences. There would be no quiet resignation, no cushy exit package. This would be a full-scale takedown. The first anonymous tip was sent the next morning. I made sure it was detailed enough to raise alarms but vague enough to keep my involvement hidden. Within hours, the audit team had flagged the discrepancies and the investigation was underway. David didn't know it yet, but his time was running out. I watched from the sidelines as the company's upper management began to scramble. Meetings were held behind closed doors, hushed conversations filled the hallways, and the mood in the office grew tense. People knew something big was coming, but no one knew just how bad it was going to get. And then, one evening, I got the call I had been waiting for. It was from one of my colleagues, the one I trusted the most. "They're bringing in external auditors," she said, her voice tense. "David's screwed. They're going to find everything." I hung up, feeling a rush of adrenaline. It was happening. After all the months of planning, the sleepless nights, and the carefully laid traps, David was finally going to face the consequences of his actions. But as I sat there, staring at the evidence on my computer screen, a strange feeling washed over me. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I had dreamed about. And yet, it didn't feel like I had expected it to. I thought I would feel victorious, triumphant even. But instead, all I felt was emptiness. Had revenge always been this hollow? Had I really spent all this time, all this energy, just to bring someone down? Shaking off the doubt, I closed my laptop. There was no turning back now. David was going to fall, and I had made sure of it. But as I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city, I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen when it was all over? Would I feel any better? Or would I just be left with nothing but the wreckage of my own anger? I didn't have an answer. Not yet, but soon enough, I would. The fallout happened faster than even I had anticipated. Within days of the auditors arriving, the rumors of David's misconduct spread like wildfire. Everyone was talking about it. The hushed whispers in the hallways, the speculative glances during meetings. It didn't take long for the whispers to turn into full-blown gossip. I kept my head down, playing the part of the unassuming employee who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But inside, I could feel the tension building, like a coiled spring ready to snap. It started with a company-wide email from upper management. The message was vague, as these things usually are. An internal investigation is being conducted to review certain financial practices. But everyone knew what it meant. David was in trouble, and the higher-ups were doing damage control. By the following week, the internal audit was no longer internal. An outside law firm had been brought in to handle the investigation, and the scope of the inquiry had expanded beyond just David. The company was bracing itself for a scandal that would undoubtedly make headlines. David tried to play it cool at first. He acted like nothing was wrong, strutting around the office with the same arrogant confidence that had always annoyed me. But I could tell something was different. His smile didn't reach his eyes anymore, and there was a new tension in his voice when he spoke to people. He knew the walls were closing in. The first major crack appeared when David stopped showing up to meetings. People noticed. He was always the guy who demanded to be involved in every decision, who micromanaged everything. But now he was making excuses, sending his second-in-command to represent him. That's when I knew things were getting serious. I kept in contact with my inside sources, the few colleagues I had trusted with the truth. They confirmed that the auditors were finding more than just the financial discrepancies I had planted. David's entire operation was unraveling hidden bonuses, fraudulent contracts, even bribes to secure high-stakes deals. The deeper the auditors dug, the more dirt they found. And then, one afternoon, it all came crashing down. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning. I was at my desk, pretending to focus on an email, when a notification popped up on my phone. A news alert. CEO of major tech firm under investigation for fraud. CFO implicated in widespread corruption scandal. The article didn't name David directly, but it didn't have to. The details were unmistakable. The company's stock had already taken a hit, and rumors of a massive legal investigation were spreading through the financial press. I couldn't help but smirk as I watched the story unfold. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. A few hours later, the inevitable happened. David was escorted out of the building by security. I didn't see it myself, but the entire office was buzzing with the news. Some people were shocked, others seemed unsurprised. But for me, it was a strange, quiet moment of satisfaction. He had fallen, just like I'd planned. But even as I watched him go down, there was no victory lap, no moment of glory. I felt disconnected from it all. It was like I had been chasing this for so long that now, seeing it play out, the impact didn't hit the way I expected it to. David's downfall was swift and public. The media jumped on the story, and within days, his name was plastered across every news outlet. Reports detailed his corruption, his misuse of company funds, and the network of lies he had built around himself. He was finished, but as I watched the chaos unfold, something began to gnaw at me. Was this what I had wanted all along? The destruction of a man who deserved it, yes, but at what cost? I had become the puppet master, pulling the strings behind the scenes, and I had gotten what I wanted. But it didn't feel like a win. David's departure sent shockwaves through the company. His closest allies were fired or resigned within days, and the restructuring process began immediately. The fallout was brutal, and no one was safe from the cleanup. Employees at every level were under scrutiny, and the atmosphere turned even colder than it had been when Lucas was exposed. It was strange, watching the company, once so stable, now teetering on the edge of collapse. And in some twisted way, I was responsible for all of it. I had set the wheels in motion, and now, I was watching everything I had known burn to the ground. As the dust settled, I found myself standing alone in the middle of it all. Lucas was long gone, David had been destroyed, and the company was a shell of what it used to be. But what about me? I had been so consumed with taking them down that I hadn't thought about what would happen after. Sure, I had destroyed David, but what was left for me? A job at a crumbling company? A life filled with secrets and guilt? The emptiness I had felt after taking down Lucas came back, stronger this time. I had won, but the victory felt hollow. What had I really gained? In the weeks that followed, I watched as the company began to pick up the pieces. A new CEO was brought in. Someone with a reputation for cleaning up corporate messes. Policies were overhauled, departments restructured, and slowly, things began to stabilize. But I wasn't part of that process. I was still on the sidelines, watching from a distance, unsure of where I fit in anymore. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, staring at the city lights outside, I realized something. Revenge hadn't brought me peace. It had only deepened the void inside me. I had destroyed 2 lives, Lucas and David, and for what? To prove a point? To satisfy some twisted sense of justice? I wasn't sure anymore, but I knew one thing: it was time to let go. To walk away from the wreckage I had created and figure out what came next. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. Without revenge, without anger. Just me. The next morning, I drafted my resignation letter. I wasn't sure where I would go, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Not after everything that had happened. As I hit send on the email, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It was done. I was done. It was time to move on. Walking out of that office for the last time felt surreal. I had spent years in that building, climbing my way up, learning the system, and then slowly dismantling it from the inside. But now, as I stepped through those glass doors, it was all behind me. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought would come with my exit. Instead, there was a heavy, empty silence, like the closing of a book I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. I had cleared out my desk in the early hours of the morning. Before most of the staff arrived, I wanted to avoid the awkward goodbyes, the fake concern from people who didn't really care about what happened. My resignation had been accepted without much fuss. After everything that had gone down with David and the company, one more departure didn't even register as a blip on the radar. I walked to my car, the city still half asleep, and paused for a moment to take it all in. The towering buildings around me, the busy streets, the constant hum of life. It all felt so distant now. I wasn't part of it anymore. And maybe that was for the best. I got in the car and started driving with no real destination in mind. I wasn't going home, not right away. I needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. The road stretched out in front of me as I headed out of the city, the morning sun casting a soft glow over the skyline in my rearview mirror. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward, not just reacting, not just chasing after some twisted form of justice. Lucas was gone, David was ruined, and I was free. Free from the toxic environment, free from the lies and betrayal, and free from the revenge that had consumed me for so long. But the question I couldn't shake was, what now? I pulled off the highway and found myself in a quiet park on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place I used to come to when I needed to clear my head, long before everything went wrong with Lucas, with my marriage, with my life. I parked the car and stepped out, the cool morning air filling my lungs as I walked over to a bench near the edge of a small pond. Sitting there, watching the water ripple in the breeze, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also regret. Regret for the way things had played out, for the destruction I had left in my wake. I had gotten what I wanted, but it had come at a cost I hadn't fully understood until now. I thought about what Lucas had done, about the affair, the lies, the betrayal. I had been so angry, so consumed by the need to punish him and Sarah, to make them pay for what they did. And I had done that. Spectacularly. But in the process, I had lost sight of myself. I had become someone I barely recognized, someone driven by revenge, not by any sense of justice. And what had it brought me? Nothing but emptiness. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and stared down at the ground. I had spent so much time focused on what Lucas and Sarah had taken from me that I never stopped to think about what I had lost on my own. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten who I was, what I wanted out of life. Beyond revenge. As I sat there, lost in thought, I realized something important. I had been living in the past for far too long. Holding onto the hurt, the anger, the betrayal, it had consumed me. And now, it was time to let it go. Sarah was gone. Lucas was gone. David was gone. I needed to let them go too. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I hadn't spoken to Sarah since the divorce papers had been finalized, hadn't even looked at her contact information. But as I scrolled through my phone, there it was, her name, her number, still saved, like a ghost haunting my past. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. I didn't need to call her, didn't need to hear her voice. But something inside me, some small part of me that still needed closure, prompted me to send one final message. It's over. I've moved on. I hope you find peace too. I hit send, and with that, it felt like a chapter of my life had truly closed. I had no idea how she would react, if she'd even respond, but that didn't matter anymore. I wasn't looking for an apology or an explanation. I just needed to let her, and everything else, go. Sitting in that park, watching the morning sun rise higher into the sky, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since I had discovered Lucas and Sarah's betrayal, I wasn't thinking about revenge, about payback, about what I had lost. I was thinking about what came next, what I wanted to do with my life now that the weight of the past had been lifted from my shoulders. It was time to rebuild. Time to figure out who I was outside of the anger, outside of the revenge. I didn't have all the answers yet, and that was okay. I had time to heal, time to rediscover myself. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was open, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to walk it. As I got back in my car and started the engine, I knew one thing for sure: I was leaving the past behind, once and for all. And wherever that road took me, I was finally ready for it.